I've never been one to fear the dark. Living in a quiet suburb of New Jersey, where the nights are filled with the gentle hum of crickets and the rustling of leaves, I always felt a sense of calm as the world settled into its nighttime rhythm. Our home, a cozy two-story house bathed in the soft glow of warm lights and the lingering aroma of fresh-baked bread, was my sanctuary. But that night, as I lay in bed on the second floor, I woke up to something unusual. It was the sound of footsteps. Faint and deliberate, like someone trying not to wake me. My eyes fluttered open, but the room was too dark to make out any details. A sliver of moonlight seeped through the gap in the curtains, just enough to illuminate the edges of the furniture. My heart quickened, but I calmed myself with a rational thought. It had to be Michael, my husband, finally home after another late night at work. Michael often worked long hours, his demanding job pulling him away from the small comforts of home. While I admired his dedication, I missed the quiet moments we used to share, our dinners together, the evenings spent on the porch with glasses of lemonade in hand, laughing about nothing in particular. I had grown used to the empty spaces he left behind, convincing myself that his absences were temporary. Hearing the soft creak of the bedroom door, I assumed he was finally back. "You're late," I murmured, my voice thick with sleep. There was no response, just the familiar warmth of a hand brushing lightly against my shoulder. It felt so much like him, gentle and grounding, that I didn't even think to turn around at first. But then, something felt off. As I began to shift toward him, I noticed the hand lingered a fraction of a second too long. It wasn't the reassuring touch I was used to. It felt hesitant, uncertain. "Michael?" I asked, my voice a little more alert. The answer I received wasn't the one I expected. "It's me, Alex," a soft voice said. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Turning quickly, I found Alex standing by the side of the bed. His tall frame was backlit by the faint glow of the hallway light, his face partially obscured by shadows. "Alex, my stepson. What are you doing here?" My words came out sharper than I intended, a mix of confusion and unease. Alex rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my gaze. "I heard something," he explained, his voice quiet. "I thought you might need help. I just wanted to check on you." The explanation felt thin, but I was too disoriented to press further. He stepped back, his face unreadable, and without waiting for a response, disappeared into the hallway. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing. The room was heavy with silence, but my mind was a cacophony of questions. Why had he come into my room? What had he really wanted? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that something wasn't right? By the time morning came, I convinced myself it was all just a misunderstanding, a product of Alex's awkwardness. He'd recently moved back in after college, adjusting to life under our roof again. Maybe he was still finding his footing, unsure of how to act around us. At breakfast, everything seemed normal. Michael had left early for work, as usual, and I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring out at the quiet street. Alex came downstairs, casual as ever, grabbed an orange from the fruit bowl, and flashed me a quick smile. "See you later," he said before heading out the door. I watched him leave, my unease from the night before still lingering. Something about the way he looked at me felt different, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I told myself I was overthinking, but deep down, I knew the truth. That night wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And as much as I tried to push it aside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The days after that strange night dragged on, heavy with questions I didn't dare to ask aloud. I tried to maintain my usual routine, cleaning, cooking, running errands, but the air in the house felt different, charged with an unspoken tension. Alex carried himself as if nothing had happened, greeting me in the mornings with an easy smile, but there was something beneath the surface I couldn't ignore. One evening, with Michael away on another business trip, I decided to settle into the living room with a book. The rain outside tapped gently against the windows, a rhythmic backdrop that should have been soothing, yet I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. The words on the page blurred together as my mind drifted back to Alex's footsteps outside my room, to the moment he stood beside my bed. The sound of the front door closing pulled me from my thoughts. Alex was back, shaking raindrops from his jacket as he stepped into the room. He hesitated for a moment before walking over to the couch, dropping down onto it with the kind of relaxed confidence that felt oddly out of place. "You're up late," he said, his voice casual but laced with curiosity. "I couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He studied me for a moment, leaning back and stretching his legs out on the coffee table. "It's strange, isn't it? Being in this big house alone when Dad's not here." I glanced up at him, unsure of how to respond. "I don't mind it," I said, hoping to steer the conversation in a safer direction. "Sometimes it's nice to have the quiet." Alex's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't the friendly kind I was used to. It felt probing, as if he was testing the waters. "You don't get lonely?" His question caught me off guard. "Not really," I answered, avoiding his gaze. "Why would you ask that?" He shrugged, looking away briefly before turning back to me. "You just seem, I don't know, like there's a lot on your mind. Like maybe you don't always get what you need." There was something unnervingly direct about his words, and I felt my pulse quicken. "Alex, I think you're reading too much into things," I said, hoping to end the conversation. But he didn't back down. "Maybe," he said, his voice soft yet persistent. "Or maybe I just notice things other people don't." The way he looked at me in that moment made my skin crawl, not because it was threatening, but because it felt so uncomfortably familiar. As if he was trying to connect with me on a level I wasn't prepared for. I stood abruptly, clutching my book to my chest like a shield. "I think it's time for me to head to bed," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Alex didn't try to stop me, but as I turned to leave, I felt his eyes on me, following me up the stairs. I didn't look back, but the weight of his gaze was impossible to ignore. In my room, I locked the door for the first time in years. The rain outside continued its steady rhythm, but it wasn't enough to drown out the thoughts racing through my mind. Something about Alex's presence tonight unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I tossed and turned for hours, haunted by the memory of his words and the way he'd looked at me. And then, just as I was beginning to drift into a restless sleep, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, I was wide awake. I sat up in bed, straining to hear through the darkness. The sound was faint but deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my room. My heart pounded as I stared at the door, half expecting it to open. But the footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse. Morning came slowly, and when I finally worked up the nerve to leave my room, Alex was already in the kitchen, frying eggs on the stove as if nothing had happened. "Morning," he said with that same easy smile. "Good morning," I replied, my voice tight. He looked at me for a moment, his expression calm but curious, as if he was waiting for me to say something. I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I turned away and poured myself a cup of coffee, trying to pretend the night before hadn't happened. But I knew deep down that it wasn't over, not even close. When Michael returned home after his business trip, everything seemed perfectly normal, at least on the surface. We sat at the dinner table, enjoying his favorite meal of roast chicken and mashed potatoes. Conversation flowed as usual, covering mundane topics like the weather, his meetings, and weekend plans. Alex was there too, quiet but polite, chiming in when needed. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I noticed things I hadn't before. The way Alex's eyes lingered on me a second too long, the way he barely engaged with Michael's questions. He wasn't rude, but his detached demeanor made it clear that his mind was elsewhere. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my plate, but the undercurrent of tension was impossible to miss. The next day, while Michael was away for work again, I decided to tidy up around the house. Cleaning always helped me clear my mind, and after the strange events of the past week, I needed the distraction. I dusted shelves, vacuumed rugs, and straightened up each room until the house looked impeccable. When I reached the guest bedroom, the room Alex had been staying in, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar. For a moment, I debated whether I should go in. It felt intrusive to step into his space while he wasn't home, but I convinced myself it was harmless. After all, it was still my house. The room was a typical mess. A jacket tossed carelessly on the bed, sneakers abandoned near the closet, and a few scattered books on the desk. I started with the bed, straightening the sheets and fluffing the pillows. As I moved toward the desk to organize the books, something caught my eye: a notebook lying open, its pages covered in hurried, uneven handwriting. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that. But my name written in bold letters on the page froze me in place. Catherine, it read. She doesn't even realize how extraordinary she is. No one else sees her the way I do. My stomach tightened as I scanned the rest of the page. The notebook was filled with Alex's thoughts about me. He'd written about small moments I barely remembered. The way I laughed at his joke last week, the dress I wore to dinner one night, even the way I tucked my hair behind my ear. It wasn't just casual observations. These were detailed, almost obsessive reflections. I slammed the notebook shut and stepped back as if it had burned me. My pulse raced, and my thoughts spiraled. Everything I dismissed before, the glances, the odd conversations, the nighttime footsteps, suddenly made sense. Alex wasn't just being awkward or adjusting to life back home. This was something much bigger, something I wasn't prepared to deal with. I quickly left the room, closing the door behind me, and spent the rest of the day pretending nothing had happened. But later that evening, Alex cornered me in the living room. "You went into my room today," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my skin prickle. I froze for a moment, then forced myself to answer. "I was cleaning," I said, keeping my tone even. He didn't look angry, but there was something unsettling in his expression, a mix of curiosity and quiet confidence. "I hope you didn't find anything surprising," he said, his words deliberately slow. My heart pounded. He knew. He knew I'd seen the notebook, and he wasn't even trying to deny it. "Alex," I began, my voice shaking slightly. "Whatever this is, it has to stop. Do you understand me?" He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Stop what?" he asked softly. "Thinking about you? Noticing you? Feeling something I can't control?" His words left me speechless. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I could feel my resolve slipping, the weight of his stare holding me in place. Finally, I managed to find my voice. "You don't understand what you're doing," I said, each word trembling but firm. "You're crossing lines that shouldn't even exist." Alex tilted his head slightly, his expression almost pitying. "Maybe you're the one who doesn't understand," he said quietly. "You're pretending this is all on me, but I see the way you look at me too." I felt my face flush with a mix of anger and disbelief. "That's enough," I said sharply, stepping back. "This ends now." I left him standing there, his expression unreadable, and retreated to my room. Behind the locked door, I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every distant sound made my heart race. I couldn't tell Michael, not yet, but I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening either. Something had to change. I just didn't know how. The next morning unfolded in slow motion. I woke up feeling drained, as if I had spent the entire night fighting an invisible battle. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to amplify every creak of the floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. I forced myself out of bed, heading downstairs with the hope that a strong cup of coffee might clear my head. Alex was already in the kitchen when I arrived, sitting at the table with a steaming mug in his hands. He looked up and greeted me with a calm smile, as though nothing had changed. "Morning," he said, his tone light, almost casual. "Morning," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. I poured myself some coffee, but my hands shook as I lifted the cup. I had spent the entire night trying to decide what to do, replaying every moment of the past few days, every word he had said, every look he had given me. Something had to give. "We need to talk," I said abruptly, breaking the silence. My voice was firmer than I expected, though my heart pounded in my chest. Alex raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair. About what? He asked, his tone innocent, but his expression anything but. About this, I said, gesturing vaguely between us. Your behavior, the things you've been saying, your notebook. It has to stop. He didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. And what exactly do you think is happening? He asked softly, his voice almost daring me to say it out loud. You know what I mean, I said, trying to steady my voice. You're crossing boundaries that shouldn't even be a question. Whatever this is, whatever you think this is, it's not okay. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence between us stretched uncomfortably. Then, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes locking onto mine. You keep saying it's not okay, he said quietly, but are you really sure about that? Because I don't think you are. His words sent a chill down my spine. Alex, I said, my voice trembling now, you need to stop this. Right now. He didn't move. What are you so afraid of? He asked, his voice calm, almost soothing. That I'll say something to Dad? Or that you might actually feel the same way? I froze, his words cutting through me like a blade. This isn't a game, I snapped. You don't get to twist this around. You're my stepson, Alex. That's all you are, and that's all you'll ever be. For the first time, his confidence seemed to falter. He leaned back, his expression darkening. You can keep telling yourself that, he said, his voice low, but we both know that's not the whole truth. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. This ends now, I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. If you say or do anything like this again, I'll tell your father everything. He stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable, before finally nodding. If that's what you want, he said, his voice flat. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and left the kitchen, my legs trembling as I climbed the stairs. Once in my bedroom, I locked the door and collapsed onto the bed, tears streaming down my face. Later that evening, Michael returned home. His presence should have brought me relief, but instead, it only heightened my anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that Alex's quiet compliance was just the calm before the storm. Over dinner, Michael noticed my unease. You seem tense, he said, his brow furrowing with concern. I'm fine, I lied, forcing a smile. Before I could say more, Alex walked into the dining room. He looked at me, then at Michael, his expression neutral, but his presence charged with unspoken tension. Michael glanced between us, sensing something was off. Is everything okay? He asked. Yes, Alex said quickly, his voice steady. Everything's fine. Michael nodded, satisfied, but I felt like the walls were closing in. Alex's calm demeanor unnerved me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding on to some unspoken truth, waiting for the perfect moment to let it surface. That night, as Michael slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I had made my choice for now. I wouldn't tell Michael. I couldn't bear to shatter the fragile stability of our family. But I knew that the silence I had chosen would haunt me, a constant reminder of the boundaries that had been crossed and the damage that could never be undone. This wasn't the ending I had hoped for. It wasn't an ending at all. It was simply a pause, the quiet before the next storm. And deep down, I knew that this story was far from over.